Oui, 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 il faut des... Ça va? Ça fait pas vite? Ça fait pas vite.
On y va. Bonsoir, bonsoir à tous.
Good evening to you all, welcome. You have been here over the past 2 days for this forum. It's a great joy to see so many people here. Welcome to the second evening. And tonight, the literary evening, the Writers in Peace. And the great thing about Normandy for Peace is that we can talk about peace in all its dimensions, 360 degrees. We've been talking about geopolitics, about international relations, weapons, the military, but also science, education, with a lot of young people. We talked of culture, with UNESCO, with a number of presenters. And we felt it was interesting, as a partnership with LOPS, to hear writers. How do they like to write on peace, about peace? How do they see and how do they look at peace? And I want to ask you all to welcome Jérôme Garcin. I'm taking off my face mask. And I want to thank all of you for being here tonight, for this literary evening, for this moment of respite in a way, because for the past 2 days at the Forum for Peace on preventing war, responding to new threats, you've heard of academics, researchers, decision makers, economists. But now the stage is for writers who are able to, if not prevent war, but to talk about war, to witness war, and to work for peace through their writing. And with me, through video conference or here, two women novelists, the Scholastic Mukasonga and Justine Augier, who both have won the Prix Renaudot when I was a jury there for that prize. And we also have the writer, diplomat, a member of the French Academy, Jean-Christophe Ruffin, Bartabas, who is a bit of a centaur because of his work on horses, but has also published a book from one horse to the other. And the journalist and historian and my friend from LOPS, François Reynard. Before we open the debate on what is literature able to do, what can literature do, something that Sartre would have loved to talk about. So I'd like to welcome here François Reynard, Justine Augier and Bartabas. Plenty of room. So through video we have Jean-Christophe Ruffin and Scholastic Mukasonga, because Jean-Christophe, I want to thank him for being here, because I know that you're in quarantine. You're not at your best physically, but you have agreed to be here at the so he's agreed to be there at the beginning of the evening. And Scholastic is not very far from what I can see. You're in Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer, aren't you? Right next door. And I'm really happy you're speaking French because English is not for me. And I think Jean-Christophe will maybe take some medicine after the evening. So I'm not going to tell you all about Jean-Christophe, but you're a doctor, you're a writer, the head of Action Against Hunger, you're a diplomat, and you've also been a member of French Academy for since 2008. You're a neurologist as a medical doctor, and you worked at the Salpêtrière, the hospital in Paris. And then you started traveling because you were a founding member of Doctors Without Borders, worked in Latin America and Africa, and in 1976 in Eritrea, where war was raging. In 1999 in the Kosovo, you were the administrator of the Première Urgence organization, first emergency organization. You're a cultural attaché in Brazil, and an advisor to François Léotard when he was a Ministry for Defense. You're a lecturer at the War College, or I hope it also is a Peace College. And in 2007, you were an ambassador in Senegal and the Gambia. While writing, you wrote the Abyssinian, Brazil Red, who won the Goncourt Prize, Immortelle Randonnée. And one of my favorite books of yours on your pilgrimage to Compostelle, and also some detective stories, some crime stories. So there was a very short depiction of what you've done. You know the theme of the evening in Caen, and of these past 2 days in Caen to prevent war. I'd like to know, because you always were in touch with conflicts, with war, as a doctor, but also as a writer. I'd like to know if you have the feeling that one took over the other, the doctor over the writer, or the other way around. Good evening to you all. Thank you for accepting me from a distance, but I think it's better that I keep my germs for myself. Regarding that relationship between medicine and war, if I chose that job, that profession, medicine, it was also with a link to war, because my grandfather was a medical doctor during the First World War, and in the Second World War he was a resistant, and he was a prisoner in a concentration camp. So for me, medicine was something that you did when you were committed, and which meant that it would lead you to encounter war. Regarding the topic, I don't know how I want to do this, Jérôme, but a few words of introduction on that notion of war before we talk about peace. But I've witnessed a number of wars, and I've taken part as a witness to various conflicts, is that most people today don't know what war is. I'll give you an example. When the conflict started in Bosnia and Sarajevo was surrounded, a lot of people in France decided, there were bakers, mechanics, they decided to go and help in Bosnia. But there was this crazy spectacle of people arriving in the middle of the battlefield, because when you arrive in a war, there's not a sign saying, "Oh, war starts here." So it's a very interesting. There's something very interesting. War is local and it's very diverse. I remember being in the Philippines when the dictator Marcos fell, and I arrived in the Philippines. I couldn't see anything in Manila, and then I had pizza, and on TV there were riots, and I asked the waiter, "What is it?" And he said, "It's the revolution." And I said, "Where?" And I said, "Where is that revolution?" He said, "Here, but not in this neighborhood." And so that local aspect is very hard to understand, because people have a global, a total representation of war. But no, it's a very diverse phenomenon, and it's very hard to grasp somehow. The second thing is that all the wars of today are very different to the wars that took place 25 years ago. 25 years ago, there was a very ordered, if you like, international landscape. There was the Cold War, there was the East and the West, and there was always one side that enabled a peace dialogue to take place. Something that would be, you could trust, something that would be constructive. But conflict are now a lot more diverse, with a lot of factions that no one controls or knows even. So when you want to build peace, it's extremely difficult, because there are people might sign an agreement, but others don't feel that it should sign, or don't feel that it's got anything to do with them. So there is the landscape of war, which is very fascinating to observe, but which means that peace today is a challenge that's even greater than it was in the past, because the mechanics of peace are extremely fine, extremely localized, like war itself, and therefore it requires a lot of patience, and we've seen it in current conflicts, be it in Afghanistan or elsewhere. Things are very short-lived. When you build peace, it doesn't necessarily come straight away, because things are too dispersed. What function would you give to the writer that you have become after having been a humanitarian doctor? Writers, I think, shouldn't have any illusions regarding their role. They are witnesses. Their action is somehow slow and underground, if you like, subterranean, unconscious, and maybe their action don't reach the people who really need their actions. You often preach to the converted, and not to people waging war. So there's a huge influence of war on literature. I'm not talking about war novels, but I'm talking about the question which is central in many works, and it's something that has always been a driving force for me to write, is the relationship to the other, because war is one extreme form of a relationship or a rapport to the other, where you see the other as the enemy, something or someone that you need to destroy, and someone you represent as being outside of humankind, because you can do anything you want to the enemy. In European wars, just to talk about these, the Great War, people would kill each other with shovels while they were 10 meters away from each other for months. They would see each other, talk to each other even, but they would deny the humanity in the other. And if the writer has a role, is to remind people that humanity is everywhere, including in the enemy, and whoever's on the other side of the trench is an enemy, political, but first and for all, that person is a brother that has the same values, maybe that is similar to you. And I think writing can maybe teach that and show that. And many writers in the past, or many contemporary writers, I think, share that desire to humanize the extreme. My last question, Jean-Christophe Ruffin, when you worked as an ambassador in Africa, in Senegal, did you have the feeling that you were really working for peace? Did you have the feeling that you were working for peace when you were working as a diplomat in Africa? It happened, yes, sometimes, not all the time. Notably regarding the Mauritania, the conflict in Mauritania, there was an extremist power in Mauritania. There was that was really causing a lot of trouble for the country, and there was a negotiation with Mauritania that I took part in, and Mauritanians came to Dakar, in the capital of Senegal, to talk. And there were two young women who were there to make tea, that very strong tea that they have in Africa. And discussions lasted for hours and hours and hours, because peace can only take place if you accept or enter the time of the other. And the time of the men from the desert is infinite. So these young women came round and gave tea. And your first glass of tea is great, but your 32nd glass of tea, when it's 5 in the morning and nothing is budged, is quite different. But it's amazing because there were several women in the delegations, and two women got up and said, nothing will come out of this, but we might be able to do something. We're gonna go into the hallway, and discuss between women and see if we can find a solution. And we'd had so much tea and it was so late that we said, okay, why not? And so they went out, and when they came back into the room, they hadn't managed to make peace, unfortunately. So thank you for being with us, and because you are fighting another enemy, which is the COVID, which is the virus. So thank you for being here, Jean-Christophe Ruffin. Dear Scholastic Mukasonga, and I often called you the Tutsi from Calvados, because you are very close in Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer. Because you were a social worker in the Calvados, right? You're not wrong, Jérôme. But yeah, because of COVID, it's not so easy, and I haven't been able to make it to Caen. You were born in the Gigonkora province in Rwanda, exiled in Burundi for a time, and you arrived in France in 1992. You started writing 15 years ago to testify about the 1994 genocide by the Hutus on the Tutsis. Your mother and father and about 30 members of your family died. Your first books, In Yenzi or Cockroaches, are a mausoleum made of paper where you honor your dead. And you won the Renaudot Prize for Our Lady of the Nile, which was made into a film, filmed by Atik Raimi. And you went back to Kigali in 2014 for the 20th anniversary of the genocide. And you have become an ambassador of peace for your native country. And I hope that your country has une femme. And you won the Segman Prize against racism and intolerance. And let's talk about that moment from 2014. We'll talk about this, but can we maybe go back to what your journey was through war? My journey, if you like, was that of a fighter. It was very, very hard. And my mission was not to die. I don't know if, but I was born, or all I've known from birth was discrimination, hatred, rejection. I grew up in a camp. I'd been deported as a Tutsi, but I was lucky to grow up with my parents, who were true resistance, who loved me, and who gave us love when, on a daily basis, it was the promise of death. Since the age of 3, I have learned not to be afraid. I have learned I have learned how to survive, and I've learned to share also, and it's very important because in that camp for deported Tutsis in Yamata, and to survive because we're surrounded by death. The military camp of Ogako, which was the second biggest military camp in Rwanda, that was supposed to stop us from going into Burundi, and we were not. In theory, we were not able to escape. And there was also a militia camp next to the next to the lake. That was the only water source for us, because we were in the desertic area in Rwanda. So yes, we had to use that lake, and so we developed solidarity. And the mothers, the women were true fighters. They did everything they could for us children to protect us from the suffering, to give us or to give us a future in life. And that's why I wanted to write as a homage to the combat, to the struggle of these women. And I grew with the love of my parents. I never thought about death, but it was there before the genocide. There were a lot of mini genocides, but as I call them, in the Rwanda. In 1963, some people were killed who tried to set up some shops in Yamata, and were thrown into jail and killed. They were sent to prison in the north of the country, and they never came back. And then 1967, young people were killed, and they were not. It was not the Samba, as we say in Kinyarwanda. It was only a group of people. It was not everyone that was killed. It was the intellectuals in 1973 when I left Rwanda. And what saved me was that I was able to be in the 10% of Tutsis that were able to go to secondary school, and I was able to learn French, and it was a passport for life. And I really love French. And then when I talk, and I'm certainly grateful to French. And I know what I owe to the fact that of the fact that I knew French and I learned French. And since '73, I've been the memory of my family. And when I heard about the genocide in 1994 in Hérouville-Saint-Clair, just outside Caen, when I arrived in 1974, in 1992, sorry, I realized that I would have to be the memory of my family, but also my country. And I was also lucky in life, the fact that I arrived in Normandy, in a place of memory, where there is also the memory of the Second World War here in Normandy. It is something that has enabled me to rebuild, to give. And my first two books, which are memories which are autobiographical. I wrote them and I wrote them in a small Canadian cemetery in Bény-sur-Mer. There was a small shelter where I could sit down. I would look at the graves. And so there was a lot of suffering. There was, of course, the cemetery would send a message of sufferance, of pain, but also a memory that is being preserved. And that is extremely important. So I was being inspired I was inspired by what I saw, and I would build a mausoleum, the tomb that my people didn't have. Scholastic, I have another question. When you went back in 1994 to Kigali for that sad anniversary of the genocide, of that, did you have the feeling then that peace had finally come back and that it would last?
Peace, that was premature. So I took some notes about what I had seen as a more pertinent answer. That was on 7th of April 94. There was a huge official ceremony at the main stadium in Kigali, which, as a matter of fact, was called Amamoro, which means peace. There were numerous speeches of heads of state who had come to support us, to be by our side. And that's an image to say that there is a peace process, because we who had known a genocide, who had lived a total abandonment by the international community, everybody had turned its back from us, we really found ourselves back in that stadium in April 94. We were no longer alone. I realized evil had been done, but one can rebuild oneself. Well, on that date in April 94, in the afternoon, there was a ceremony dedicated to a special event in a school where in 94, during genocide, thousands of Tutsi had gathered and had been murdered. And now we were in 2014. The stadium was full up. There was a huge crowd around the place. Even on the playing ground, there was huge of people. I managed with great difficulty to find a place for me. In the middle of the field, there were children singing the song, which is the hymn of remembrance, Pribuka in our language, which was the name of the ceremony. The children were singing. They were saying that it was the everlasting fire, which is yours and mine. Each of these kids was holding a torch, and they were each of them dancing. While singing, there were also testimonies of people who had survived or had been witnessed, or even of militians who had been to jail. So that's an image which is already different and fake. Scholastic, I'm sorry, but I have to ask you to be shorter because the people here at the rostrum have to speak too. There must be a debate. So, is there a last word you could say to those participating in that forum? My last word concerning peace is the distribution of a ribbon, a little bit of tissue that everybody was handing over to its neighbor, where you were supposed to write something. But I was so impressed by all these people coming to contribute to the building of peace in Rwanda that I didn't put any word on the ribbon. And I didn't give it back. I took it with me and I wrote it down in my book. In my book as a link to people. So that day was an image of peace for all the people gathered, people from Rwanda gathered there. The international community was with us. And the huge Hutus who had abandoned us were present too. Thanks a lot, so Scholastic, for being with us. Thanks to Vision Conference. And now, here, we have duly present Justine Augier. I remember that you worked for a French NGO for the UN. You lived in Kabul, in Vienna, Jerusalem, New York, Beirut. Your latest book, published in 2017, which won you the Renaudot Prize, talks about a Syrian activist for human rights kidnapped in 2013 by a Salafist group whom we never heard about since. You tell us how that woman stood against Bashar al-Assad's regime, documenting all crimes and violations committed in Syria, where she was forbidden to go out in the street. You write that you've always needed to live away from Paris, from France, and far from the literary world. You got close to those places which were places of war. You were a testimony in your books. Even if we can consider that book de l'Ardeur as the basis for the book Jérusalem, which is something very current, very contemporary, useful for peace. Well, that's interesting. You're really entering the topic. Useful. I don't know how we can measure literature's utility to fight for peace. This being said, I think literature has, better said, always tries to gather the complexity of reality, its multiplicity. That's what Jean-Christophe was saying concerning mankind, that we try to find out in each of us. I think a conflict always appears when there is a refusal to face that multiplicity, when one closes oneself in univocal readings of reality. Good literature, for me, precisely tries to give thickness to reality. And I think that's a role it has, an important role. But there's another one, I believe. Well, after that, you may talk about that other role, but we're now heading for a debate. Well, I studied first literature and international relations. I've always been in the middle of those two fields trying to find my place. And I was very young when I went to Afghanistan after Taliban's were destroyed. There was great optimism in the country back in 2002. I was very optimistic myself. I was very young. But then I started questioning myself when the Americans and British intervened in Iraq. And our situation in Kabul became very complicated as representatives of the international community. The places, the neighborhood where we were was being targeted, and I became aware of the complexity in which I was stuck, of what I belonged to, even if I may not have wanted it. I had inherited from the colonial world. I was unable to grasp that as an actress. And that's really when I went to literature. And then it took me some more years, and that's when I arrived in Jerusalem, that I understood the violence of people who close themselves up in fixed identities. That's really at the root of conflicts, i.e., considering the other for what he is and not what he says or does, condemning that person. So this is a reality which is stuck and which can not surprise you when you say, I know who you are. That's extremely violent. It's something that became important in my writing experience, finding my place in today's world. That's the power of literature, I believe. And now, Bartabas, let's listen to you. As I was saying, your book, D'un cheval l'autre, where you write about what your life was through the horses that you rode, some of which have disappeared. Apart from being a great book, is linked to all the entertainment you have organized, call the world, very often through music, with singers from Caucasian or Barbarian origins, with dance in a triptych, or even religious men in other of your shows, and even Mexicans in Caracas that you organized. Well, my feeling is that you've always put the whole world present in your Zingaro shows. And that's good for peace. Yes, indeed, that's a very important aspect of Zingaro, which we don't talk enough about. Because, of course, everything is focused on the relationship between men and horses, which is our specificity. But for me, it's important to bring in the human element inside the company. It took me some time to understand that it's not the fruit of an intellectual reflection. It came from a very simple fact. That when I thought, well, how can a guy from Courbevoie like myself cry when he hears a singer from Rajasthan? In other words, beyond culture, music can gather men? And I don't have any answer for that. It's an enigma. And I understand that by inviting guests for each project, and each one of them takes 2 to 3 years to organize, really it's something very open to different people with another religion, another way of life, and from countries which are not always in peace. Indeed, yes, indeed. So a little bit, I feel a little bit like if I were a micro society from outside, look for what would be a universal mankind. What leads me to inviting these people, to go into the deserts, to convince them to come, Tibet or anywhere else, convince them to come and participate to a project I don't even know beforehand. What motivates me? Well, I try to have exchanges with the first inhabitants, first men. I'm really fascinated by very concrete things. And of course, like anyone, I listen to geopolitics, conflicts, etc. But I managed to gather people so different, like Muslims and Hindus, who don't eat in the same dishes, don't go to the same toilets. But after 2 years working at Zingaro, they ate together the same dish. For me, it's quite considerable. It's everyday life, getting to know these people, accepting differences, trying to understand them, never being brutal. You do not convince anyone with authority, but I realize that when President Sarkozy comes somewhere saying, "Well, we're gonna teach you democracy," well, in some countries it doesn't mean anything. You have to understand that in some countries it's the strongest who will win. Some dictators, that's strange to say, understand what the real geopolitical balances are. Another story I can tell you is with Langas and Mangani, as we had invited each one with a bed, shower, everything had been prepared. They arrived, they get to Aubervilliers, and I saw there was a little difficulty, an embarrassment, and our translator explained that they wanted to have 3 beds together because in their culture they never sleep alone. They wanted to have 3 beds by side. Otherwise, they really get bad. They don't feel well. Well, there's another one I can tell you quickly, rather funny, with them. Well, they came from the desert with clothes, their jewels, but no knickers. At the hotel in Brussels, they arrive and see our caravans. And then one day, the hotel came to see me and said, "Can you ask your musicians to stop blowing their nose on the carpet?" And I said, "What's going on?" It's interesting. It's not any rocker singer being complicated in his hotel room, but that in the desert they just put their finger on their nose and that's it, blow the nose like that. For them, the carpet was nothing more important than the sand in the desert. It was no provocation, but it gives rise to strange situations. if you have to explain to a Rajasthan musician, it is complicated. So this is what I understand as the difference of others, understanding their origin. I'm not talking about war with a capital W, peace with a capital P, but I'm talking about understanding the other based on observation and acceptance. And on fear too, because racism and all that, it's based on fear. And then I'm back to horses. The first lesson that horses taught me when someone asked me when I was a kid what I liked about horses. And I explained it was because I wanted to go beyond my fear. I was fascinated by horses, but I didn't think it natural to ride one when you were young. I just was afraid of unknown things. Well, one last point. Don't you tend to consider that horses are naturally pacifists and men naturally soldiers, warriors? Well, that's really the debate. Well, man is the only animal that invented war. He liked it, and he went on. What about horses? Animals don't wage wars. They have an animal violence. Very often you talk about an animal aspect, but it's a sexual violence, a sexual energy. But among animals, none of them wage wars. No way. There may be sexual conflicts between males, dominance, but there's no organization to defend IDs. And I can tell you that the more we go forward, the more we observe animals and their behavior, I notice that nowadays difference between men and animals is not compassion as I would have thought 10 years ago. No, there is an acceptance of others and of life that animals have, but not men. That's their problem.
Bien sûr, avec
Depuis longtemps.
François Reynard, you've been silent for so long. You have a degree from Sciences Po. You're a journalist at l'Obs. You wrote a book in 2006, which is still current, called Une Golden en dessert, an apple for dessert. A book on everything that depresses you and gives you means to get out of that. You're passionate about history. You wrote a book about the history of France and the origins of France and a lot of debunking myth about this. And you wrote a history of the Arab world as well. A quick question: as a journalist, François, have you been on the battlefront? No, never. I started my career dealing with religion as a journalist. All the people I talked to were talking about peace. And I was born in 1960, and all I've ever known is a country at peace. And there are very few people in the history of France or in the history of the world. It's quite exceptional to benefit from that, and I benefit from it on a daily basis. And as a journalist, I've seen arguments, I've seen people shouting at each other, but never war. My second question is to the historian. Does one know when writers or have started to document, to testify about the wars that they were witnessing? I'll reply to your question, but differently. When I heard when you talked to me about this conference on this forum on righteousness and war, and the first thing that came to my mind was the First World War, All Quiet on the Western Front, or the Wooden Crosses by Dorgelès, and that's what Ruffin does. That's what Scholastic do. They denounce war, but historically it's quite recent. Most historians before that were in favor of war, either to try to explain it, and in the Western tradition, it's Thucydides, the Greek, ancient Greek writer, who was the first who wrote the War of the Peloponnese between Sparta and Athens, and he's the first scientist, if you like, where he explained war, not saying it's the gods that want this and that, but it's the arguments between. But he was talking about disagreements between people. He was a general as well in Athens, and he was able to explain the origins of war. But there's not a tradition of there's a good tradition of writers in war, which is the writers that write about their war, the war that they have experienced. Julius Caesar, for instance, Churchill. Winston Churchill won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he was very disappointed because he thought he deserved the Nobel Prize for Peace, and he was vexed. But de Gaulle wanted the Nobel Prize for Literature. So these were people who were telling about their war, who was narrating their war, but they're not denouncing war. They explain what happened and why they were on the good side of the conflict. That's true for de Gaulle and Churchill, but not necessarily for Julius Caesar, because Julius Caesar was talking about his conquest, and he intended to. And it's Julius Caesar who created Vercingetorix, who's the chief of the Gauls, who was probably not that important, and he made Vercingetorix into a very important historical character, and Vercingetorix became a hero for France because his enemy had said that he was important when he probably wasn't. And there were people, historians, who were singing the praises of the war of the king that they were working for. So in the Middle Ages, for instance, the chronicle writers, I don't know if there's a guy who's called Froissart in the 100-Year War between France and England. And he was a really good writer, but he was also saying good things about English kings. But there was another example that I found in the 17th century, which is Louis XIV. Louis XIV wanted his wars to be praised. And the French Academy was created by Richelieu, but the Academy at the time of Louis XIV was designed, which is the expression of letters and encryptions, was made for people to sing the praise of Louis XIV. And there were two historiographers for the king. They're called Boileau and Racine, two very famous French writers. But in terms of historiography, Louis XIV would travel Europe to wage war, but they were not really happy to go there. And some versions said that Boileau would not follow Louis XIV in his conquest because he had health problems, and Racine wouldn't go either, but mostly because they hated it, and Louis XIV got angry because he had conquered the city of Ghent in Belgium today, and he wasn't very happy because Racine wasn't there, and Racine was a great playwright, but he was also a great courtesan. And he said the reason why I wasn't there on the battlefront when you conquered Ghent, he said that, well, my tailor was too slow. I ordered a suit to celebrate your victory, but you won before my tailor had the time to finish my suit. So yes, there was a lot of writers who wrote on the Great War. We talk about Remarque, Barbus, and so forth. And they wrote a lot about the war, and they were all against the war, but it never stopped the second. the Great War, the First World War, is a very important moment in that respect, because yes, there are the writers we remember, but there were other writers that we have forgotten who were in favor of the war. Someone like Maurice Barrès, who was from the far right against Dreyfus. Maurice Barrès in the Figaro would write in favor of the war every day. And the Canard Enchaîné, the satirical writer, called him the Nightingale of the Massacre. And he felt that as a writer he had to push for war and for valiance. And in the Marseillaise, there's this verse on young people who have to go to war as well. But in the people who denounce war, who are against war, these are writers that we have. I remember The Fire by Barbus, which won the Goncourt Prize in 1916, and it was very much loved by the people who were on the battlefront, and hated by the people who wasn't fighting, because it felt it was a defeatist book. And Dorgelès didn't win the Goncourt Prize, and Proust won it, who never went to war. And yeah, and Proust won the Goncourt Prize in 1919, and maybe people were fed up with war in 1919. But yes, to reply to your answer, Jérôme, that literature never stopped, never prevented the following war, with the paradox, which is that it's not the same war. In the 30s, there was a pacifist trend who said, no, we shouldn't have another war and so forth, and they were pushing for accepting everything that Hitler did, who wanted to appease Hitler for the Munich Treaty and so forth, for reasons you can understand, noble reasons. We had a massacre once. Let's not have it twice. But it wasn't the second war wasn't the same. It was not it wasn't a war between two countries that shouldn't have fought each other, but it was a war against a tyrant. It's the forum for war, not for peace. A question to Justine Augier, but also to François Reynard, who's a great reader, and to the horseman writer Bartabas. Is writing, even in a country at peace, is it taking sides when in front of a radical opposition, like Justine that you was not in Jerusalem or in Lebanon, in Afghanistan? When is writing, even as a witness, is it taking sides for one or the other? I don't know if it's testifying or a testimony in what I write, but yes, there's a form of commitment, that's for sure. But starting to write, whatever you write about, is a form of commitment. It's an attempt to find a way to be in the world, to share your vision. So yes, there's taking sides, but the force of literature is not doing it in a binary way. But doing it and taking into account the complexity of things doesn't mean that you do it in a soft way or in a non-committal way. We have to question reality. We have to question the way things are. And I think it is a form of commitment that is very strong. When I was told you have to animate a debate, moderate a debate on peace and literature, I had this idea, which is still around, that you can't write a good book with nice feelings, and maybe you can produce better literature with war than with peace. Is it the forum of peace or the forum of war? It's a question. Because I thought about peace. What is peace? In my field, if you like, in my tiny field, but of humans, animals. What is peace? What does it mean to be at peace with yourself? it starts there. Peace is opposed to war, but peace is very personal. What does it mean to each of you to be at peace with yourself? And in my reading, I would say that the animal is more at peace with themselves than the human, because the human, the problem with the animal, that I can't have the animal around the table because an animal doesn't read or write. But I think the problem for the human being is that when you're 5 or 6, you know that you're going to die. The older you get, you know you've only got a certain time on Earth, and that's where the problem comes from. They invent a god, they write, they express themselves to exist beyond themselves, to be at peace with themselves. An animal is at peace with themselves, and that's it. And that's that notion of peace that we need to analyze, because if you want to take a bit of distance and go beyond conflicts, why have human beings invented war? It might sound like a really stupid question or idealistic question, but why haven't men or human beings, haven't they lived at peace forever? No, I don't have an answer, but I'm working on it. François, now a double question. Do you think that writing is necessarily being committed, taking sides, or can you write a good book that would work for peace? I think I'll answer, but taking a sidestep. A good writer needs to be on the right side, historically speaking. And there's an example that I find fascinating. There's a Spanish poet, which is Antonio Machado, that all Spanish people love. He died in Collioure during the Civil War in Spain in the late 30s, and there's been songs. His poem have been turned into songs by Juan Manuel Serrat, like Ferrat and Aragon in French. And Antonio Machado today is considered by the greatest Spanish poet by all Spaniards, and he was on the right side. He was with the Republicans. He was in Madrid, then Barcelona, and he did the Retirada with all the people who crossed the Pyrenees in France when Franco took over, and he died exhausted in Collioure. He had several brothers, and there's one that's called Manuel Machado, and Manuel Machado was also a poet. He was a playwright, like his brother. They were very close. They did all their career together, and they came to Paris. They came to Paris, and they were friends with the same poets in Paris. And when when Franco's coup took place, Manuel Machado went to Burgos, and he remained stuck in Burgos because Franco's coup was done from Morocco, but the Spanish cities or the barracks took their sides, and some barracks went to the Frankist side, and some to the Republican side. And Manuel Machado was in Burgos, while Antonio Machado was in Paris. Manuel Machado was seen as a Republican. He was close to the Communist Party, but he became a Frankist. And he accepted positions, and he died not long after the war. But he was a museum director, and he was considered as a great support of Franco. And Trapiello, who's a Spanish writer who wrote a great book on the Civil War and Spanish literature, and he said Manuel Machado fell on the wrong side of history, because he says that because the Franquists won the war, but the communists wrote about the war. So the communists won the narrative of the Spanish war, but even when the Franquists won the war. And so one brother was on the right side and one on the wrong side. And in the early 30s, people considered that they were both as good a poet as the other. But today, one is considered a great poet, and the other one is only seen as a fascist. And of course, I'm closer to Republicans than to Franquists, but is, I don't know if literature is above, and you know that but you worked a lot on writers and resistance collaboration, Jérôme.
Writers able to foresee wars, to announce them? Can they see things beforehand? That's one of the topics in Caen, but I never had any answer. Well, someone wrote the Bible a little bit for that reason, but it didn't work. Well, coming back to the 1914 war, it's very interesting, that war, because before it, no one could foresee it, and half of Europe, or at least 30% of Europe, were socialists and pacifists who could not imagine that there would be a war. Jaurès was murdered in July 1914, and the paper L'Humanité gave us a title. They killed Jaurès, and he used to say, we won't do that war. It's a capitalism trick to prevent us from understanding ourselves. And 2 days later, Germany declares war. And that same paper says, gives us a title, Our Defense First. But then all writers go to the front. They all wage war. And Romain Rolland is the only one who, well, as he was in Switzerland, in Geneva, I think, in the mountains, he was the only one to say, I'm not coming back to France. He became the great pacifist who wrote that manifeste, a beautiful manifeste, Au-dessus de la Mêlée, where he said, I don't want that horrible murdering. He was criticized by all writers, French or German, saying that he was horrible. I think he was the only one to be right at the time. Well, fine. We started with personal stories. I'd like us to finish that debate with Youth Tree. First, I turn to Justine Augier because we still do not know what happened to Ghazan, who's one of the characters in your book, De l'Ardeur. What are you writing about nowadays? And do you still write with the wish of being closer to people who were victims, like Razan was, victims of the worst regime in your fictional world? Well, about what writers can do to prevent wars, I'd like to come back to one point which we haven't dealt with, which is the responsibility of writers as to language. What do you mean? Well, there are periods in history where tensions grow, but a loss of capacity to say a reality, very often the disconnection between significance and signified. There's a suspicion on information, and language suffers. Clichés also very invasive. Arène talked about the way she was fascinated by language, but when there's no capacity to think, then that's when evil arrives. That's a huge responsibility. Ella Scanetti said that a writer is the warrant of language. I believe in that responsibility. It's nothing huge, but I like to believe in it. As for my projects, ongoing projects, no, I haven't really left Syria apart. I've just finished a book which tells the story of a Syrian intellectual whose wife disappeared at the same time as Razan, who fled to Germany in Berlin with the idea of finding in European history elements to understand Syrian history. So I'm still with that, with what Victor Serge called the defeated intelligences, those who commit themselves freely. Yes, my responsibility is to continue writing their stories. And it's going to be published soon, yes, in January. Last question, a bit indiscreet, you may not answer. You have gone to almost all countries in the world. Which really made you happier? Well, I was very happy in all the countries I lived in Beirut, in Jerusalem, because I really felt I was at the center of the world. And today I live in Paris, which is terribly exotic. Thanks. Thanks a lot, Justine Augier. Well, now I turn to you, Bartabas. Were you contaminated by the virus of writing after D'un Cheval l'Autre? Just one point first. I think a lot was oriented around journalism, writing, war writers. But if we think about the role of writers for peace, I think this has to do with each of us. It's something very personal that each one of us does at his own rhythm, his own way, like a poet. A poet is really one of the main writers of peace. He doesn't deal with current news right away. He works in deep. He will be a vector of peace. All of those poets, you think? Yes, I think they work at the level of the deepest feelings of their readers. Not only literature, which commands things. Well, for me, the fact of writing allows me to say that today the real talking is the written talk. It's the one that remains, that each of us can accept at his own rhythm and which will last. I think that if you ask me what the role of a writer is in peace, I would say rather the poet, which would be the greatest thing for writers. Well, and now another last question. Ever since your book, we're wondering if you still be making shows. Well, indeed, on November 3rd, we have one in Aubervilliers called Silent Talk. I'm on my own on a horse, no more light, no more music, just me on a horse. Well, what happened with the musics of the world? Well, I fired them all. Well, that's true. Well, because of COVID, I had to start something new. We'll see what it gives. It's a bit ambitious. Oh, there will be no war. Yes, a little bit perhaps. But when I start writing, I don't know what I'm getting to. But the idea is to show how an animal became a man in a poetic way, not a scientific way. It's a shift towards mankind. All this time I spent on shows how an animal can become a little bit human. just the way we became humans working, because humans are the only animals that work. Well, thanks a lot, Bartabas. And finally now, François Renard. I've always admired you for leading with history without never being depressed. Good reasons though. Oh well, the Years' War is better. My question is, will you continue to deal with history, great history, and finding reasons for optimism? What I think great in history is a debate today that says the history of France is a block. Let's not touch it. Like Zemmour or etc., as if history were a pantheon. No, I don't think like that. I think history is a field in which we have to have an analytical intelligence, try to read in history so as not to do the same stupid things again, and study things to try to have better things today than yesterday. Something called progress, studying the wars of the past to try to avoid wars tomorrow. Well, read all these books. I'm really happy that this Normandy Forum for Peace is ending with writers and artists, because I really think it's with them we can build peace. Thanks Justine Augier, Scholastique Magassonner, Jean-Christophe Cuvin, and François Renard. Cheers, cheers. Cheers to you, really, thanks a lot. What a lovely evening. There couldn't be any better closing evening. It really shows what the Forum for Peace tries to do, showing all cultures, photo, painting, music, and tonight literature. And I think that in the casting of tonight, we have all the diversity which we try to bring forth in the forum. All those stories that were told with such authenticity. This is very specific to the forum. We try to put forward our mankind, act for the other, not to be seen as an enemy, but foremost as a human being. Well, indeed, that's the closing of our third edition of the Normandy Forum for Peace. We weren't certain to be able to get it organized. We had to face COVID. We had to face the climate and storms. Thanks then to Jérôme Garcin, to his guests, to everybody from Lobs. That was a great day. It was great to end with literature. Thanks to the public who came in such great numbers. 6,000 persons ever since yesterday morning. Thanks to the mayor of Caen. 3 years ago, we launched in a utopic adventure, but I think the intention was good. We'll go on that same path with the wish to force peace in all its dimensions. See you for the 4th edition soon, but Normandy for Peace goes on. It doesn't stop between the 2 editions, and not only Normandy, on the 5 continents. Long live peace, thanks to all. Well, we took good note, thanks a lot.